But now, for the event that you've been waiting for, tonight's presentation, as I said, is sponsored by our Arts and Lectures Committee. It is free and obviously open to the public as well as students who came tonight. These events generally take place on Mondays at the noon hour here on the Santa Rosa campus, but tonight's presentation is going to be longer than an hour and much more in depth than we could possibly cover in the small, short time period we usually have. So these Friday night events are special events for us, and we're delighted that so many of you could join us. I guess it's good that there's really no baseball that we're competing with tonight. At least the important baseball that we're competing with. So the Arts and Lectures Committee is comprised of faculty and staff and students, and Jürgen Kramer, to my right, is a member of that committee, and this presentation was his brainchild, and he is going to talk to you a little bit about that. And joining him in tonight's presentation are Eric Thompson to my far left and Scott Fuller to his right. All are faculty here at Santa Rosa Junior College, and they're preeminent faculty here, and you are in for quite an evening. So without further ado, thank you again for coming, and I'm going to introduce Jürgen Kramer.
Thank you, Carrie, and welcome here tonight for a wild ride through the paradoxes of transcendence, mystical experience, rationality, and madness. This is the book that gave me originally the idea. It's called The Fingerprints of God by Barbara Bradley Haggerty, and it's a popular book. It's quite readable. And I was mentioning it to Scott, and Scott had an interest, and then we pulled in Eric. So we started to collaborate from our three different perspectives to develop this presentation here. Let me give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be doing here tonight. We're first going to do some introductions where we tell you just a little bit about why we are interested in the topic, what brought us to this topic. We're going to give you definitions of mystical experiences. We're going to address the question, is there such a thing as a universal mystical experience? Common pathways to mystical experience, such as meditation, etc. How do mystical experiences relate to personality factors, culture, and mystical experience? And how does culture either inhibit or promote mystical experiences or support mystical experiences and modernity, and what to do with all of that, how to balance rationality and these extraordinary experiences. I want to point out that we're going to take 2 short breaks along the way where we're just going to pause and we're going to invite questions that pertain directly to the content, not discussion questions. And then we'll have time for discussion at the very end. So in between, when we pause a little bit, we want to invite you to ask any questions where, clarification is needed or things of that nature. What we really want to do, because we are not the holders of the truth, we're the holder of multiple truths. We'll hope to facilitate a dialogue. We hope to facilitate inquiry, questioning, and hope to raise questions. What tonight is not about is God or goddess, faith, or religious dogmata. What tonight is about are the experiences that, in a sense, come before that lead to later maybe to belief systems, to dogmas, etc. So I'll start talking just a little bit about myself, and part of my background is in shamanism, both in terms of researching shamanic experiences, theorizing about shamanic experiences, and being a practitioner of shamanism. Part of what has happened for me is that, I've had experiences where there really aren't very good rational explanations in sort of the conventional mainstream paradigm, right? When you see something that by all appearances is, I don't have any other word for it, a spirit that seems very real, what do you do with that? What do you make of that, right? So it's experiences like that that seem inexplicable and for which I don't have any other words that really led me into a deeper inquiry of this. And I'm not a believer in shamanism. I'm a practitioner of shamanism. Shamanism is very pragmatic. It's about doing and accomplishing certain things, and you either do that or not. You either accomplish your goals or you don't. And it's much less about belief. So I'm kind of an agnostic, shamanic practitioner who talks to spirits. So part of my assumption is, why this topic is important is that there is a persistent interest in these experiences. That it's not going away, and now and then it's on the rise, and it seems to be a bit on the rise. And I think actually there is a historical need at this point to balance our left brain rationality, kind of the one-dimensional rationality, with the other side, as it were, with our right brain balancing it and having a more holistic sense of who we are in the world. One of the greatest challenges that I see is to relate to mystical experiences in a way that doesn't just kick rationality off the boat, or maybe I should say it differently, that kicks rationality off the boat, but not reason. So I'm interested in how can we dialogue about it, because so much of what's said about these experiences ends up being dogmatic in one form or another, where somebody comes up, in a hierarchy and says, well, this is what it means. This is what it is. And how can we have, a dialogue, and I use the word concourse, a coming together and talking together, having a discussion about this. I see these mystical experiences as a human potential that everybody has. I think, some of us are better at it than others. It's like some of us are more gifted in playing the violin than others. And it is trainable. It's a skill that can be built. And again, some of us will be better at it than others.
That's you. That's you. And those are your words.
These are my words. I can move around, right? We're not tied to our pulpit.
No. Podium. Wrong.
Pulpit. No, it's a pulpit.
We're going to get some preaching tonight.
So, hello? Hello? Am I on? I don't know where the best thing is. That good? Is yours on?
Hello?
Yeah. Okay, so three things that I want to say by way of introduction in the same kind of vein as Jürgen shared. First of all, professionally, I'm an instructor here of religious studies, and I teach and study and research anything that relates to religious studies and beyond. My primary expertise is in the Western religious traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, most especially the texts, most especially the scriptures, the history, and all that jazz. So that's where I spend most of my time, exegeting, explicating Bible and Quran and everything related to that. But I have interests in all the components that go into the culture and ideas that those texts represent. So that's a little bit about my professional methodology. I'm basically a critical biblical scholar. Now, in terms of my personal experience with this issue, I have two very distinct areas of experience. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, my mother became deeply involved with what I don't even know what to call it. Some people would call it, I suppose, New Age or or New Age spirituality or something. And so to the extent that I have any kind of religious upbringing, that would be it. And from about the age of 8 or 9 until I was 17, I was trained by my mother to do all kinds of things. We had seances. She made us, for a while, she made us, all of us kids, I was the oldest of 4, and she made us wear cloves of garlic around our neck to keep us from getting spirits and stuff in us. We practiced. She trained us in arts of psychic healing and reading of auras. I learned how to read tarot cards, to read palms. She was even into moles for a while, moleology, and I never got into that myself. But I read palms. I used to, when I was 12 years old, I used to make money, instead of selling lemonade, I made money reading palms for the neighborhood kids and stuff. I did astrological charts, and I had many experiences. My mother explained to me the theory and guided me in the practice of astro travel and various things like that. Right. So I was very steeped in that, and it's like that's one way of being religious. And as Jürgen said, I just want to echo that. This is a way in which I was religious or spiritual, and if you want to distinguish those two things, I guess it would be more spiritual than religious, because there wasn't really anything involved that relates to faith, that relates to what Jews and Christians and Muslims would call faith. It was just simply an area of exploration, an area of experience that I investigated, and sometimes I had experiences, and sometimes there was just no way of knowing how to explain them or what to do with them. They just sort of sat there, and my mother, it was sort of my spiritual mentor, if you want to put it that way, sometimes she had a theoretical explanation for what these things were, but not always. Sometimes they were just, whoa, whoa, right? And that's basically all you could say about it. Then, when I was 17, I was born again. I went through a dramatic, life-changing conversion to fundamentalist Christianity. And so I went away one day, to my family's great consternation. I went away with hair down to here and raggy old secondhand army fatigues, and I came back with a polyester suit and a crew cut and a leather Bible, preaching, right? And so, in that new mode, and I was in the Christian. I was a Christian, practicing, professing, and very gung ho for about 17 years altogether. In the stage where I was really gung ho and adopted more or less a fundamentalist kind of theology that lasted for several years, but it kind of gradually developed out. I developed out of it. But during that time, I had what is very commonly reported, and part of experiences, not just, I was later to learn, not just of Christian experience, but Muslim and Buddhist, and this is a theme in all religions. I had visions, I had dreams, I had mystical experiences and encounters with Jesus in my bedroom, and all kinds of things that I related to the mystical experiences that I had under a different context and under a different name before. So I've had personal experience with this kind of thing in two very distinctive contexts, along with two very distinctive types of narrative. And I'll talk about that later, but that's come from that experience. And then on top of that, I have 14 years of formal training in theology and biblical studies, and 23 years of teaching experience, in which I have critically investigated and analyzed those narratives, those experiences, and everything to do with them. And so that gives me yet a different perspective. And here, this is we each kind of came up with a thesis statement for our contribution, and this is mine. Mystical experience must be distinguished from its theological interpretation. Although mystical experiences transcend cultural particularities, how they are interpreted and that they should be expected and in what form varies culturally. And so often correlates to cultural expectation that it seems clear that human culture plays a role not only in the processing, but in the production of mystical experience. Right? So what I'm arguing here, and I'll get into the specifics later as the evening unfolds, is that mystical experiences and how we think of them and how we interpret them are two completely different things, two different processes, and I think cultural formulation are involved in every aspect of it.
Okay, for me, this is all part of a very personal journey that I've been trying to deal with for, I think, all my adult life. And so I just want to share with you 3 experiences, and then as, again, the evening unfolds, I'll keep putting them back into a context. When I was a younger fellow, I studied Zen with a wonderful Zen teacher, Maizumi Roshi, down at Zen Center, Los Angeles. And as part of that training in the particular kind of Zen that he practiced, you would get a koan. And a koan is, I don't even quite know how to describe them. They're kind of funny stories. And so as a beginner, we were all given the koan mu. And it's a very simple one. It's a monk comes up to the great Zen master Joshu and asks Joshu, Joshu, does dog have Buddha nature? And Joshu looks at him and then lets out this big, whoa! And that's the koan. So in your first year or so of training, they put all the new students together in a room, and during these prolonged meditation retreats called sesshin, you sit and you all moo together. There's a part of it that's just wonderfully ludicrous. Moo, moo, and the whole room mooing, and then, as the sesshin moves on, mooing late into the night, and so on and so forth. And then you go and you have what's called dokusan, which is a face-to-face meeting with the teacher, where you display your understanding. And initially, I think for most of us, the understanding is pretty, Buddha nature, everything's got Buddha nature. Yeah, dog's got Buddha nature. And, Roshi would look at you, not good enough, go away, and on and on. But then, after about 4 or 5 days, we were talking about this, with these meditation retreats, there's a period of days, and about 4 or 5 days, you're just worn down and you're tired. And, and there's all this mooing and not sleeping. And so finally, I had dokusan and went in, and I just yelled. All I could yell. Just, I can't even do it anymore. I lost my voice. It was horrible. But in that moment, something remarkable happened. I felt the universe pass through me. I still had my own consciousness, but I felt this unbelievable connection. And for a moment and I have no idea how long it was, I sat there. And, now retrospectively, I was feeling bliss and all those other wonderful things and totally connected and all that. And then I finally snapped to, and I look at Maizumi, and he's a funny guy anyway, and he kind of looks at me and says, "So, Scott, now what are you going to do?" And I spent the next 40 years trying to figure that out. The second experience I want to share with you took place in Paris a few years ago, and I think it's probably a fairly common kind of experience that people have. This is at Saint-Étienne-du-Mont, which is a Catholic... Pardon? Oh, it's a Catholic cathedral. And I went with some friends on Easter Sunday to an Easter Mass. And it's gorgeous inside, and the light is streaming through the beautiful stained glass windows. And there was an organ, and they were playing, I don't know exactly, I think it was Poulin or something like that, but it's gorgeous music. And I felt this literally unbearable experience. It started out as goosebumps and then moved to tearing up. And then it was the point where I felt like I was going to explode. I literally, physically couldn't stand it anymore. And it was beyond elation. It was something that was almost physically painful. Thank God it stopped, and I went on. And then the last experience, again, there's an irony because I'm a Buddhist and these both took place in Catholic churches, and I was scratching my head about that for a long time. I shared this one with Jürgen a while ago. This is the crypt of St. Francis in Assisi. And again, I was with Kathleen, and it's a very powerful place, and so we went in, and I think you started crying. She started crying immediately because they have the word peace in all the languages of people. And you walk in and you go, ah! So we went down to the crypt and sat there quietly. And I forget, we sat a long time. I mean, a very, very long time. And enough time so that there was no sense of time passing. And I had this unbelievable sense of presence. And I don't know who it was or what it was. You know, because I'm not a Christian, it could have been St. Francis. Jürgen said, St. Francis was a pretty powerful shaman. And, they used to build those churches over pagan sites. So who knows? I had no idea. But this, again, an unbelievably powerful kind of experience. Now, though the experiences are transient, a very huge residue was left with me. And a few years ago, I had to undergo treatment for cancer. And what got me through that, interestingly enough, was going all the way back to the Dokusan with Maizumi, where I realized, because they thought I was going to die, I wasn't afraid. At least I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid, but I was afraid of surgery, chemo, doctors. I was terrified of that, but I wasn't afraid of dying. So it's interesting that there's a residue. So all this stuff we're going to be talking about tonight is very, very, very personal for me. Okay, very quickly then. I think that when you look at any human phenomena, and I'll now try to speed this up quite a bit. You look at any human phenomena, you have to recognize that we as humans live in four worlds, and these four worlds interact and operate simultaneously. We have a biological world that has an evolutionary history. So some exploration of mystical states has to include the biology, has to include the brain. We live in a psychological world. We have unique psychological histories. In some ways, though we are very much alike, we are also totally and completely unique. And it's understanding those unique psychological histories, for lack of a better term, our personalities, that is also very important. We live in a social world. We live in historical time and space. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that, how we live in the 21st century is different than how people lived in the 19th century. And the beliefs, the ideas, as Eric was talking about, you have to look at all of this stuff in a cultural context. And that cultural context is constantly moving and shifting, developing. And then finally, we live in a spiritual world, for lack of a better term. Each of us has the potential connection for an unseen world. For some of us, it's God. Who knows? I won't even go there to try to define it. As we talk tonight, for all of us, I think you have to recognize that it's not just one of those worlds. And whenever you analyze something like mysticism through just the lens of one of those worlds, it is simply not sufficient. It is simply not sufficient. It's all of these worlds interacting together that you have to do. And that is unbelievably complex and difficult. And so the journey that we're going to go on is not a simple journey. Okay? So the interaction then of all these different worlds. Finally, my thesis is, as humans, we're pre-wired for mystical experience. It comes out of our evolutionary history. Towards the end of this evening, I'll show you all the interesting brain mechanisms. There's a whole new discipline called neurotheology that looks at the interaction between mystical experiences and what's going on in the brain. And that's why you find mystical experiences in all human cultures. But I think, as both Jürgen and Eric pointed out, like other universals, there's tremendous individual differences. We have different capacities, though I think it's stuff that can be learned. And it's dramatically affected, shaped by, and filtered through the culture.
Okay, so we're going to spend just a little bit of time right now to look at, definitions of mystical experiences and what they look like in different traditions. So I'm going to start out to talk about mystical experiences in the shamanic traditions. And as with all of this, there's a whole diversity, a whole range of different cultures. There are indigenous that, where there are shamans, and shaman, doesn't refer to a man. It can be a woman or a man, and it comes from the Tungus shaman, which is to see. And a shaman is, one of the oftentimes used definitions is that the shaman is somebody who consciously can alter his or her state of consciousness, enter and use that state of consciousness, whatever he or she enters, for the benefit of the community in some form. That may be finding a lost sheep, that may be finding a lost reindeer, that may be healing somebody, that may be finding an herb that heals, any of those tasks. So I said this before, there is a very pragmatic aspect to shamanism. So shamans are, in a sense, experts at altering their state of consciousness. And we may think about, how do you do that? Drumming or any of those things. When they're very experienced, and I've seen them, I'll never forget when I was with Rolling Thunder, who was an intertribal Cherokee, Shoshone intertribal medicine man. He would just go there, just in a split second. He could enter, a different state of consciousness. So what I want to show you here is a visionary experience that this young man has, who has actually, in his family, there is a tradition of shamanism, of shamans. And so here he has a precognitive experience. He went out to rescue the sheep that had gotten lost. This is in Mongolia. And he looks and sees his yurt on fire, right? So he goes into what, looks like a seizure, right? Looks like an epileptic seizure, on the face of it. What saves him is his horse, right? His horse comes and gives him warmth, and then, later on, the grandfather goes out to look for him and rescues him and brings him back into the yurt. Now in this clip you see how a shaman works and uses altered states of consciousness or mystical experiences to help somebody. So the grandfather went out to call in the local shaman, and here she is, she appears. And the movie goes back and forth, and I will explain it as we go along here, between our consensual reality and whatever the shamanic reality, the visionary reality, the dream reality. So here she sees the soul of the young man outside in the wilderness. So here she starts her work by using the jaw harp to, alter her state of consciousness and to work on reaching him. So she's calling him. So this is again in the dream reality. He's out there lost. His soul is lost. This would be described as soul loss. So she is starting to reach him. He starts to, his soul starts to respond. And now she's out there, this is her spirit out there in the dream reality, looking for the young man's soul, looking where he is, and she calls him. She calls him with the help of various spirit animal allies that she has. And obviously she has gotten his attention. He starts to move. His soul is starting to, move around. Here again, she's still out there in the dream. And Mongolian shamans, have commented on this movie that this is a very authentic depiction of what their work looks like. So here his soul is roaming. He's trying to find his body, basically. So here, you can hear the hawk in what she's doing. She calls him. And these kind of convulsions you see frequently when people have gone into a very deep trance or have been in a possession trance, when they go in or are coming out. And you see here she has been able to retrieve his soul, as the shaman would say, and brought it back. And so he is returning from unconsciousness and is waking up. During shamanic initiation, during the shamanic training, basically what the shaman learns is how to navigate these states, right? Instead of getting lost, like he was called, but he got lost, right? He needed the help of the shaman. So in the training or during the initiation, the shaman learns how to do that without getting lost, how to develop the skills, the focus, the mindfulness to return to his body, to where he belongs.
I am the most kinesthetic person I know. I literally can't think without moving. Which is very interesting to me how the material that I deal with, mostly that I study and teach, it represents a very different, a very alternative kind of cultural style. So I'm going to say something just for a couple of minutes about the desert religions. And by desert religions, these religions, the religions that I'm mainly on about, are called collectively by various names. They are called collectively, people within them tend to like to call them the religions of the book. They are also called the Abrahamic religions or the monotheistic religions. I like desert religion. The others work too, but for different reasons. But this is where they come from. And one of the things about the religions that I'm talking about, the Judaism, first the Hebrew Bible, the development of the ancient traditions, religious traditions, and the religious writings of ancient Israel that eventually give us the Bible, the Jewish Bible, which is the foundation, the matrix out of which comes Christianity, and the two of them form the matrix out of which comes Islam, and then later another example that I'll fold into this group is Mormonism, where you have the cultural traditions of all of those, including Islam, give the cultural environment, the milieu, out of which Mormonism comes. And so they all, it's meaningful, I think, to speak of them as a stream of tradition even though there's much diversity within all of them, there's diversity within Judaism, within Christianity, within Islam, and even within Mormonism, yet they are all belong to a stream of tradition, each of which owes its essential foundations, the essential stock of its ideas to the predecessor, the original model, the prototype being the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. And this is the birthplace. This is the birthplace of the God. This is literally, I mean, more or less, I'm talking about the general environment. This is a picture I took while hiking in the Judean wilderness in the vicinity of the southern Dead Sea. And in fact, the earliest biblical poems in Hebrew that we have locate the origin and rise of the God of the Bible here, specifically. Now, do I just point to you? There's some more of it. Here I am hiking in the hills, and there's a road that goes down to the Dead Sea in the distance. And this is where the stuff that forms the basic foundation of biblical thought, this is where it originates. This is where it comes from. Another scene high in the hills above the Dead Sea, a cave here, right? It's very typical. The Bible has many references, and in fact, most of the encounters with God in the early parts of the Bible are in the desert. Virtually all of them are had by someone wandering alone in the desert in a place just like this. And so there are people who, Elijah, for example, there are stories in the Bible of Elijah going and living in a cave for periods of time, and so on, right? And so this is the origin and birthplace of them. One of the things that is just different about the tradition and the style and the cultural formulation of mystical experiences in the desert religions, which contrasts strikingly with shamanism, is that they are almost all, in all the religions I'm talking about, almost all in the form of of a theophany. Sometimes we use the word epiphany, and epiphany is a familiar word to most of us, right? And that comes from a Greek word. Epi is the Greek preposition upon, right? And phany comes from the Greek word phino, which means to appear, right? An appearance. And so a theophany is an appearance of God. And these experiences that are narrated in biblical traditions, first in the Hebrew Bible, and then more of them in the Christian scriptures called the New Testament, and then on into Islam and on into Mormonism and other places that are dependent on this, they almost always involve an encounter with a being. The center of it isn't an encounter with a spirit world. It's an encounter with a specific being who's always at the center stage. And sometimes that being is God, or is understood to be the divinity, the deity of the desert. His name is Yahweh, is what his mama called him. And, or his emissary. Sometimes the language is of an angel. The Hebrew, there's a Hebrew expression, the malach Yahweh. Sometimes it uses that language, the messenger of Yahweh, right, rather than Yahweh himself. Although the language, as the narrative progresses, it's clear that the designations Yahweh and the messenger of Yahweh are interchangeable, right? Example, Moses and the burning bush. Something some of us may have read in the Bible or seen on the movie with Charlton Heston, or the Disney remake of it, right? Moses is wandering in the wilderness and he sees a bush on fire and he's amazed and he goes over to it and a voice from the fire tells him, take your shoes off. And it's the Malach Yahweh in Hebrew, right? And Moses has a conversation with it. There are many examples of this in the Hebrew Bible and on. So just a couple of highlights. Abraham has visions of God where God appears to him. It's always God appearing to him, and there's an audible voice. It's a deity, a personage who speaks to him. Ezekiel is one of my favorite places. Ezekiel famously saw the wheel. In the book of Ezekiel, chapter 1, Ezekiel describes himself as one of the Jewish exiles who had been carried to exile in Babylon. And so he's sitting in Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq, which is even more like this than this is, right? And Ezekiel describes seeing over the horizon. He sees a storm. He sees a storm brewing, a cloud, and it comes near, and he sees it's like a thunderstorm. He sees a collection of clouds and flashing light, and he describes lightning. And then, as it gets closer, he describes wheels, like a big chariot. Then he describes that on the corners of this chariot are living creatures which have 4 faces on one head. And wings, 6 sets of wings. It's difficult to determine from the Hebrew text whether there's 6 sets of wings or 4. It's not clear, but there's bunches of wings. And it moves around, and then there's a dome on top of it with flashing light. There's a Hebrew word which is used that occurs only in this one place, chashmal. And nobody knows exactly what that word means, but it's flashy. And in modern Hebrew, that's the word that they used when they recreated the Hebrew language for modern society, that means electricity. And then God is on top of it. This whole apparatus that Ezekiel sees, God is sitting on the top of it. And God speaks to him, right? Later on, several chapters later, in chapter 8 of Ezekiel, Ezekiel's sitting in his house. And he describes himself sitting in his house, talking to the elders of Judah. And God suddenly, he describes it as the hand of God is on him. And then God picks him up. He sees a hand, something like a form of a hand, reaching out, grabbing him by the head, by the priestly tassels on his headdress, and picking him up and taking him to Jerusalem, which is about 600 miles away, and showing him around the temple, right? So you have all these dramatic experiences. Later on, the Bible is loaded with these kinds of things. Paul, very famously, of Tarsus, Saul of Tarsus, who later is called Paul, is persecuting the Christians in the book of Acts. And there's a story which is told 3 different times in the book of Acts in the Christian scriptures where he's going to get the Christians, going to persecute the Christians. And Jesus appears to him in this grand, dramatic vision from the sky and knocks him down and says, "Why are you persecuting me?" This vision from the sky is a person. It's always a lord from the sky in the desert religions, right? Later on, Muhammad, and let's flip ahead a couple of that's a person I know. Her name's Rhonda.
And her mother's here.
Yeah, and her mother's here. and her stepfather, Jim. I'll get to this as an example in just a second. But the desert is the birthplace of all these. But then these traditions keep getting explored and expressed, and there is always new permutations of this basic theme. Right, and so a couple of examples. Muhammad, I have a text here on one of my slides of Muhammad, who has his first initial encounter with God. Only in Islamic tradition, it's the angel Gabriel. Right, God is an entity that cannot be experienced so directly. So God has in Islam, God is always mediated by an angel who's Jibril in Arabic, Gabriel, which is it's a borrowing from the biblical Gabriel, right? And so this tradition is a tradition, and it owes a part of its life to the preceding. That's part of what I mean by tradition. And so it describes in the Hadith, I have a text here that I'll show you in a second, from the Hadith, where it describes in detail all of the nuances and contours of Muhammad's experience of his first revelation, right? And it's extremely profound. And Muhammad had this while he was praying by himself in a cave and had been fasting for some time, right? You might have weird experiences too. And then another. Here it is. This is the text. So I'm getting this from all of my Islamic literature has the Arabic on facing pages, right? So you have the Arabic, but this here is a description of the messenger of God, a messenger of Allah, and it says this is the Hadith is sayings, right, from traditions that are reminiscences of the prophet in detail from the people who knew him. The sources are usually identified as his wives and his friends and various people in his life. So Aisha was his favorite wife. And she said the first revelation that was granted to the messenger of Allah, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, which is obligatory, you have to say that every time you refer to Muhammad, was the true dream in a state of sleep, so that he never dreamed a dream, but the truth of it shone forth like the dawn of the morning, right? So they're wanting to distinguish an ordinary dream from this kind of experience. Then solitude became dear to him, and he used to seclude himself in the cave of Hira. And therein he devoted himself to divine worship for several nights before he came back to his family. You can't read this, can you? Sorry, it's kind of small. Took provisions for this retirement. Then he would return to Khadija, that's his wife, and take more provisions for a similar period until the truth came to him while he was in the cave of Hira. So the angel, Gabriel, came to him and said, read. And this is a striking thing in the Islamic tradition, because Muhammad is illiterate. And that's what he says to the angel. The angel says, Qara, read. And Muhammad says, dude, I can't read, right? Sometimes I think that some of my students want to tell me that. Anyway, the prophet said, I am not one who can read. And then he goes on. So anyway, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but it goes on to describe how Muhammad felt the presence of the angel pressing down on him so that he couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. It was like a very large, very strong man holding him down. And he struggled against it, and finally it left him, and then it dictated to him this poem. In Arabic, read, and it goes on for a few lines. In the Quran, it's Surah 96. Surah 96. And this initial poem is called the embryo in the Quran. And then the narrative of the hadith goes on to describe how after the presence left him, then Muhammad went out doubting. He's doubting what had happened to him. He's not sure that it was real. He's trying to shake it off, trying to figure out whether it was a dream. And he comes out of the cave and he sees Gabriel standing on the horizon, and his being, his body, fills the entire sky. And he says, I am Gabriel, and I just talked to you. Dude, that was really me. It's real. And so then Muhammad takes that back, and that is the initial event that creates Islam according to the tradition, right? And then just another guy that I want to come back to in a bit, who's had a text up there, which I'll come back to him. But a guy that I've been reading rereading lately, last couple of weeks, St. Anthony. St. Anthony was a Christian, a devoted Christian in the early 4th century, who began a trend that became epidemic. By the mid-4th century, the 350s, 360s, this became a noted epidemic. That he was an Egyptian Christian, and what he believed was that he really needed, in order to realize a fully spiritual, fully religious life as a Christian, he needed to leave society and not ever have to deal with another person. And so he went out into the desert in the middle part of the Nile, the Egyptian Nile, and he lived in a tomb for 20 years by himself. He arranged this tomb cave so that no one could get in or out, and there was just a little bit of a hole in the top of it, and he sat there and prayed and worshipped by himself, and he had arranged for friends to lower down a single crust of bread and a jar of water to him every day. And that's what he lived on, right? And then he came, after 20 years in the cave, then he came back and began teaching all of the things, the wisdom that he gained, and all of it, and telling of his experiences. And then he became the original one of a whole slew of early Christian monks that became known collectively as the Desert Fathers. Again, they're going into the desert. So I'll come back to some of these examples I have under later themes.
I've team taught with him for years, and I get, what am I talking about? Okay, a couple of things just to kind of reiterate. In most of human history, the religious structures that we lived with as human beings were shamanic. Okay? And essential to the shamanic tradition is to have experience. What we forget is in the early desert religions, it was the same. And one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later is I cannot think of a major world religion that did not start out from somebody having a mystical experience and becoming a charismatic leader, and then that slowly gets translated, legitimated, and bureaucratized, becomes dogma, and is gone. So we'll look at that process, but it's important to recognize that even in the desert religion traditions, okay, Jesus went to the desert, Moses had his burning bush, and the prophet Muhammad all had what are classically defined mystical experiences. In the Asian tradition, and I'll go through this quickly, because in some sense this is not a class in comparative religion, even though we could turn it into that pretty quickly. In the Asian traditions, particularly in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, there's a tremendous emphasis on having direct experience, on having what we'll end up calling mystical experiences. And in some way, that's how they differ from contemporary Western religions, because the whole idea of the practice is, in fact, to have the experience. Okay, I'll go through this pretty quickly. Alan Watts once joked, and when I was a kid, I used to go hear Alan Watts when he was in Sausalito, once joked that Buddhism was Hinduism for export. And all my Buddhist friends really get pissed off at that. But when I talk about Hinduism, you'll see immediately that Buddhism has a huge amount in common with it. And of course, you'll also see that Buddhism has a lot in common with Taoism, because Buddhism went from India to China. The Buddhists and the Taoists said, oh my goodness, let's be friends with each other. So it's no surprise or no accident that even though there's tremendous differences between each of these theological systems, you're going to see a certain amount of commonality. That's because they did not evolve in isolation of each other. Okay? So in the basic formulation of Hinduism, the whole idea is that there's a merger between Atman and Brahman. I am Atma Brahman, Atman, self, and self now, and we'll talk about it when we talk about Jungian psychology, self, not the little self. That will mostly be ego that we'll use that word. Self, the larger self that's connected, merges with, becomes Brahman being itself. The term yoga means union. And so the whole foundations of Hinduism and Hindu philosophy are for each of us as individuals to eventually have union, eventually merge, eventually connect with the larger world of the spirit, which of course is central to mystical experience. I won't go into depth on each of these. The Hindus have perhaps developed one of the most sophisticated forms of this exploration, with all the different forms that yoga takes, from the control of the breath to control of the mind to control of action to control of love to the control of energy itself and the Kundalini. This is an example of the Kundalini system, which is about moving energies through the chakras, all again with the intention of, at some point, developing some form of enlightenment. What's fascinating here in the West, and this is just a commentary, is that we've taken these spiritual technologies and we've turned them into not only ways of making money, but we've turned them into practical technologies for well-being. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's somewhat ironic that hatha yoga now is what you do for health, not to meet God. That Kundalini becomes more about developing esoteric powers that you can use to make friends and influence people. And so again, one of the things that becomes interesting is to look at how American culture transforms these systems. One of the interesting things about, again, Indian culture is that they have institutionalized the quest. If you are a high caste, if you're a Brahmin, the expectation is when you get to be actually 20 years younger than me, when you get to be in your 40s, early 50s, you say goodbye. You become a sannyasi. You leave the family, you leave the business, and you go on the quest. And so literally, when you travel around India, you see all these guys, commonly called sadhus, who are wandering around doing all kinds of interesting things. Sometimes they don't have clothes on, sometimes they do. Sometimes they're smoking dope, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're doing yoga. Next slide. Sometimes they're not, but they live close to the bone, they hang out with each other, and they're looking for God. Buddhism, and again, without getting into too much detail about this, Buddhism emerged out of the cultural foundations of Hinduism. And again, the terms in Buddhism are very close to what you find in Hinduism. And again, I'm giving you a horrible, gross stereotype. But the whole idea is to obtain nirvana, which is to break the cycle of reincarnation, of birth, death, and rebirth. That's done through having experiences of enlightenment, satori. And satori is obtained by prolonged periods of samadhi, deep meditation understanding. And this is all set out in the Buddhist framework by the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. In Buddhism, there are some divisions, although one of the most interesting things about Buddhism as a world religion, it's remarkable how much consistency there is in basic beliefs. Whether you practice Tibetan Buddhism, or whether you practice Zen Buddhism, or whether you practice some form of Theravadan Buddhism, the fundamental beliefs and practices are virtually identical. Mahayana Buddhism, sometimes called the Great Vehicle, is practiced in Japan, in China. Vajrayana, this is Theravadan Buddhism, is sometimes called Hinayana, but that's a pejorative term meaning lesser vehicle, is practiced in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, in the southern part of Asia, and then Vajrayana is Tibetan Buddhism, although again Vajrayana you can find in Japan, called Shingon, but it's the practice that's mostly associated with Tibet. Okay. Taoism is the third, and it's the one probably least accessible to us here in the West, and at least understood. Let me recommend 3 books that deal with Taoism. Most of us, know about the Tao Te Ching, which is one of the most read books in all of human history. It's up there with the Bible. There's like 50 English translations available and all that. Very few people know that Taoism is a formal religion. You can go to San Francisco, go to a Taoist temple, have rituals performed, and that it is a whole set of practices. So let me just very quickly read you a description of the nature of Taoist practice. And for those of you who know a little bit about Buddhism or Hinduism, this is going to sound really, really, really familiar. Blind to perfection, men live darkly. Lost to all knowledge of the Tao, they pursue unworthy goals. Piling up gold upon gold, jade upon jade, they contend for wealth, rank, power, and fame. Opening the gates of the 6 senses, they steep themselves in extravagant luxury and foolish ostentation. Yet some there are who know how to value the teaching without words. This is now referring to the Tao itself. To value the teaching without words. To cultivate the art of leaving well alone. Eschewing the high pinnacles of fame, the manacles of wealth, they take their case and wander through the lonely vales, far from the haunts of men, and sit enwrapped in contemplation of the interplay of the shining vapors. Free from passion and inordinate desire, in stillness they absorb the cloud-like cosmic essences, blend them with the secret treasures of the body, and attain the light within. Attuned to nature's rhythms, they perceive the Tao. Rightly, they are called immortals, for when time is ripe, they leap on the backs of dragons, and rising from the earth, enter but do not loiter at the gates of heaven, that they swiftly obtain the source. Thus they return winging ecstatically to the lofty, lucent ocean. Themselves now limitless, eternal, they plunge into the void. And again, that could be Hindu, that could be Buddhist. That was the slide we wanted. Those are the Taoist immortals. Okay. So out of all this, then a question comes. We see throughout human history, throughout a huge range of human cultures, people reporting mystical experiences. So one of the questions that's come up, and it's come up for a long time, is there a universal set of mystical experiences? Is, in fact, as I'll try to talk about later, at a biological level, are we pre-wired for this stuff? And that's why you find it in all these different guises in human history. Aldous Huxley, probably in the 20th century, first proposed this as what he called the perennial philosophy. That is, when you scratch not the orthodox religions, but when you scratch their mystical sources, that's sometimes called the esoteric religions, you find that they have much more in common than they have in terms of difference. Okay? The first, not first, but probably the major Western thinker to really try to define what mystical experience is was William James in his book, The Variety of Religious Experience. Highly recommend that you take a look at this book. It is as relevant today as it was in the early 20th century. Basically, and throughout the rest of the presentations, what I want you to do is watch for these different qualities that mystical experiences have. James said that they were ineffable, which meant you couldn't find the words for them. Okay, they're not available to the rational mind as a description. And when you try to describe your experiences, you sound really silly. Okay. Second is they're noetic, meaning you have some sense of gaining special knowledge, that there's some new understanding that comes out of these experiences. Third, that they're transient, meaning they don't last, okay? And then fourth, James thought that they were passive, meaning they came and went and there was nothing that you could do to make them happen. That one probably all three of us would disagree with. The other major thinker, and for me I think one of my favorites is Walter Stace, who wrote a book called Mysticism and Philosophy. Okay, and what Stace did was develop this fascinating system where he said, look, there's really two major kinds of mystical experience. One that transcends time and space. And the feeling there that you get is you lose yourself. You lose time, you lose space, you're gone. Okay? And the other, he called extrovertive, is that you keep your consciousness, but you have this tremendous sense of awareness and connection. The experience that I described to you that I had in the Zen situation was the extrovertive, meaning consciousness was there, but this experience of oneness, of interconnection with everything. And then the last fellow is, that I want to talk about is Walter Pahnke. He was a professor at Harvard, did a lot of the original LSD studies with Tim Leary. And Pahnke did a study where he gave like psilocybin to divinity students, and they all had these great epiphanies on and on. These are the qualities that he attributes to mysticism, and these we're going to see over and over again. First is a sense of unity, so a sense of connection. Secondly is you have the sense that you are experiencing a special truth. Third is that you transcend time and space. Fourth is a sense of sacredness. That was the experience I had in Assisi. I didn't know what, but it felt sacred. That you feel very, very positive. That in fact the euphoria, the joy can be overwhelming. That was the experience that I had in Paris. There's a paradoxicality, which is this stuff doesn't make sense logically. Seeing Geists, seeing spirits, what do you do with that? Ineffability, you can't talk about it. The transient nature, the fact that it passes. And then finally, in the end, for an awful lot of people that had mystical experiences, the fact that the stuff stays with you.
Okay, and I think we should do this here really fast. Do you want to, Scott?
Oh, we're done. Yeah,
We're done.
Okay, it's you.
Okay, so I want to talk about, and I'm trying to do this very quickly, some of the pitfalls in interpreting the research that is around about what happens when people have these extraordinary experiences. One is to assume that the mind is a brain product, which is a materialist assumption. And it's kind of the wager that we have that materialism ultimately will be able to explain everything. And we don't allow for the possibility that the brain-mind relationship may be different. And James, who was just mentioned, for example, had a view that the brain acts as a filter rather than as the cause of mental manifestations. So there's a different emphasis on that. And I'm sorry that this is not quite legible down there, but 11 to 20% of people who've undergone cardiac arrest report experiences that suggest that the mind can express itself without the brain, that there is something going on, that it's independent of neural functioning. Another pitfall is the focus on only one side of the equation, meaning changes in the brain function change the mental states. And it is also really important to look at the flip side, meaning how does the mind impact the brain. Very often, experiences that are superficially similar are seen as identical. For example, when somebody goes into a possession trance or a medium and incorporates a different personality that is seen or identified as dissociative identity disorder or a multiple personality disorder, or the other example there is when a jet pilot induces hypoxia, meaning a lack of insufficient oxygen through acceleration, then that is a near-death experience, and that's like other near-death experiences. Another common pitfall is when somebody finds a brain region that is responsible for an experience, then overgeneralizing from there that that's the brain region that is the final answer to whatever these mystical experiences are. And the brain is the final source. Now, we can stimulate parts of our brain, the auditory parts of the brain, and we can hear voices, right? But that doesn't mean that there isn't sound out there, right? So it's that kind of fallacy. Ignoring the complexities of who we are, and Scott mentioned initially the different levels. We're very complex beings, and the same type of experience can have different causes, can be part of a different chain of events. You have the example of when your heart beats really fast, tachycardia. That can be anxiety, that can be heart failure, that can be just because you're exercising or you've taken a lot of cocaine, right? Oftentimes people come up with hypotheses which are really not testable, that assume a lot, that have very speculative assumptions in there, where it's very difficult to actually gather empirical support. And oftentimes these are also generated by people who actually don't have direct contact with the people. They're sort of secondhand, and they don't have direct contact with the people who go through these experiences. And this is an important point because so much, especially in psychology, research is done with graduate students, right? So graduate students may be meditators, but they're probably more beginning meditators, right? So if we actually research people who have a lot of experience, like one of the people who hung out in the caves in the desert or in the caves in the Himalayas, and who really have very mature experiences, that might show us a lot more than when we research people who are more at the beginning stages. Here's something that's very important, and I want to talk about how the functioning of our brain has changed over time, and how we look at personality has changed over time. There's a very interesting book by Ian McGilchrist, And he talks about, our different hemispheres. And what we usually see, and some of you may be familiar with this, there's a whole, there are these catalogs, language is in the left hemisphere, the visual is in the right hemisphere. And his argument is that that's actually not really so helpful. The stereotypes are the left is sort of the gritty, rational, that's what we are, realistic, but it's kind of a little bit boring on that side of the brain, And the right side, is much more creative and exciting, but it's a little, airy-fairy, a little bit out there, and a little bit impressionistic, So research has increasingly shown that basically with everything that we're doing, both hemispheres are involved, whether it's reason, whether it's language, creativity, and so, which raises the question, why is there an asymmetry in how we're using the brain? And he makes the point that these hemispheres are really presenting different worlds. So everything that we're doing is going on in both hemispheres. The difference is how we process in these hemispheres. That's really the important difference. So the left deals with pieces of information, while the right deals with the larger picture, with the holism, with a gestalt, putting it together. So right and left, coexist on a daily basis, but they have different, objectives. Now, the point that he's making in this book, and this is a very scholarly book with 80 pages of references, I mean, it's quite incredible, in 6-point no less, that the two hemispheres have undergone a power struggle for the last several hundred years, and we have shifted to the dominance of the left brain. And ultimately, the left brain is actually dependent on the right brain, but we're kind of stuck in the left brain. And the left brain has insufficient awareness of the right brain. So we're now living in this hall of mirrors of the left brain. And we don't know how to get to the pieces in the right hand, in the right hemisphere that allow us to really understand reality more completely. In the past, and these are kind of the things that we've already pointed to. This was balanced, because people were connected with nature. The arts were important. The things that are disappearing out of the school curriculum these days. Religion, spirituality was important. Dreams and visions. So all of that was balancing the left brain activity. Now, the power has shifted, and we're becoming increasingly mechanistic and fragmented. And something very interesting happens. There seems to be this experience of power which leads to an optimism. At the same time, there's sort of a paranoia and a fear and a sense of emptiness. And those are kind of coexisting together. What will happen to us in the future? Well, at the same time, we have this optimism that we can control everything. Technology can control everything. So all this is not to say that reason is not important, language is not important, but it is about counterbalancing excessive rationality. The title of his book is The Master and His Emissary, and he takes that from a story that Friedrich Nietzsche has. And basically, whatever, Alexander or, some emperor, sends out an emissary to deal with a province, and then, that emissary basically takes over the region. And that's kind of how he looks at what happened with the left brain, which is really an emissary of the right brain. And the left brain has usurped the powers and chained the right brain that really allows us to integrate and be holistic. So the emissary betrays the master. And I think I'm going to go through this just a little bit. I talk about it in terms of, this is another image where you have the different brain levels. MacLean talks about the triune brain, the neomammalian brain, our frontal cortex, our neocortex, the emotional brain, the paleomammalian brain, and the reptilian brain, which deals with the brain stem, etc., that deals with the automatic functions. And basically in this state, they're kind of really disconnected from each other, which also leads to a different sense of self that reflected in psychologically speaking, meaning a self that is very well boundaried, that is split off or dissociated from nature, from spiritual experiences, and they're less and less accessible. And I could say a lot more about that, but I won't. So,
let's take a moment here for questions. You might even want to stand up for a minute. Does your left brain hurt? My left brain is numb.
Do you have left brain fatigue?
Does anybody have any questions at this juncture?
We will. We're going to return to all of this.
Yes.
all right, I think it's time to resume.
Yeah.
It depends the worlds that you got to see him in. He could be the most loving.
We noticed that there are
attentive, but
lots
he
of
could also
wonderful
be cruel
questions.
yeah.
So we'll try to do is we're going to accelerate a little bit. So
we're going to Eric. We're going to accelerate.
So
yeah. So we're going to fly.
you're advised to fasten your seatbelts, and so that we have a lot of time for discussion here. So I want to talk very quickly about integrative states of consciousness, which is a constructive term that really refers to, these mystical experiences, these extraordinary experiences, bring different parts of the brain to talk to each other. Oops. And, I have to reach so far over here. It's sort of, I keep touching other things. So these different parts, the rational part of the brain, the emotional part of the brain, and the kind of automatic part of the brain to talk to each other. So when we go into these states, they generally give you something that is profound in a psychological sense, in a spiritual sense, or in a religious sense. This is kind of a technical description of these integrative states. So there is a slowing down, slow wave activity across the frontal lobes. The limbic system, the emotional brain that holds our emotional memory, that holds our memories, becomes more accessible, becomes more dominant. We're going into a parasympathetic, relaxed state. And left and right frontal lobe gets synchronized. The right brain becomes more important and dominant. So when we go into the deeper states, the transcendent states, the mystical states, then actually in all the different traditions, the language becomes very, very similar, whether it's in shamanism, whether it's in Taoism, whether it's in Christianity or any of the other traditions. So I was going to talk a little bit about the phenomenology, what it actually looks like, how these look differently in meditation and in trances and possession trances, but I'm going to do this very quickly because there are differences in terms of how much you control. Like obviously when you sit down for meditation, you control that and you say, okay, I'm going to whatever. You set your timer and after 20 minutes your meditation is over, and you watch how your flow of awareness is. You're in your body, and generally that's a good experience, and the more you meditate, the more positive the experience gets. I'm sorry, this slide is so dark. In possession trance, basically the person leaves and something else takes over, a kind of an alternate personality or an entity as the lingo goes. And that person then talks and is present. So the person has kind of emptied out, and that includes the experience of glossolalia, speaking in tongues. In shamanic trance, there is partial control, the awareness of the surroundings is reduced, and very often this is described as a journey. The person is in a disembodied soul, which is what we saw, right? We saw the shaman out there in the dream world. We saw the soul, of the young man out there. And it is controlled, and you can learn the control. These are all factors that impact how we experience this. The situational factors, immediate factors, our wishes and desires, some of which may be conscious, some of which may be unconscious. So we may go into a cathedral and don't have a conscious wish, but have an unconscious wish to have a certain experience. And then long-term factors, which we'll talk more about, culture, personality, and all of that. Okay, and I'm just going to flip through these, and we're going to do this very quickly. There are all these different pathways, and you've probably heard about several of them, if not all of them, right? Entheogens, hallucinogens, whether it's ayahuasca, peyote, or any of those, or that's one pathway to mystical experiences where people have encounters with gods, may have dialogues with gods, spirits, goddesses, whichever way, or animals, or become animals, and have mystical experiences. Dancing, one of the slides that I had before was really, in many traditions, you don't just use one approach. You increase the power by using several things at the same time, right? You fast, you dance, you have constant drumming and singing, right? So you kind of triple the power. That would be like in the sun dance, and then there are prayers, Or, many of these things are designed, like overtone chanting, Tibetan bowls, any of that, to interrupt kind of our habitual way of being in the world, so that something new can open up, so that it shifts our state of consciousness. And some of the composers, there's so many different ways to access this. When I grew up in the Protestant church, it really didn't work for me, and the priest made the mistake. He gave me Beethoven symphonies. That did much more for me in terms of transcendent experiences than what happened on Sunday morning. All right, take it away, real fast.
So another pathway. So just to clarify a point. Mystical experience, different religious traditions, and speaking from the desert ones, many times mystical experiences are a matter of discipline. They're set up. There are certain very specific formulae to induce them, and one of the ones that's really interesting in Christianity in particular, I'm going to focus on that, is the use of visual helps to enter into a mystical experience. In people, the monastics that I referred to earlier, the monks that went out in the desert, or the stories of Moses, who was just tripping around in the desert, and all of a sudden, bam, something unexpected, unplanned for, and so on, just happened upon him. In Christianity, there developed especially in basically in all early Christianity, it gradually developed so that by the 4th century, it was widely in place. That one of the main differences in Christianity between the West and the East was what kind of visual aids they used to enter into divine experience, to enter into God's presence in the act of worship. In the West, they used 3-dimensional images, statues, which you still see in Roman Catholic churches. And in the East, in Greek-speaking churches, they use 2-dimensional images, which they call icons. And in fact, there was a church split over this. In the Seventh Ecumenical Council was a debate over whether it was proper to use 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional images. So in the Byzantine church, Byzantine is a word, Eastern Orthodox all kind of refer to the same general thing. Icons are used, and they're used as a matter of self-consciously. They worried a little bit about this because if you know anything about the biblical tradition, the commandment 1, first commandment, no images. Don't make any images, right? And so Islam is a religion that really kind of sticks to that. Judaism has always stuck to that, except for sometimes. But Christianity has generally departed from it. And for Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox theology, the justification for that is, since God put on essentially flesh in Christian belief in the form of Jesus, that literally negated that commandment. That the incarnation of Jesus as God now makes it not only legitimate to use images to enter into the divine presence, but for Orthodox Christians, it's mandatory. Essentially, you must use images. It's required. And the idea is that if you go to an Orthodox Christian service, you can't help but see all the pictures, all the images. And they call these, in Orthodox circles, they call these windows to heaven. And the idea is, it's essentially, it's a meditative technique, only they wouldn't call it meditation. But it's really rather similar to some of the meditation techniques that are found in Eastern religions. You gaze at the icon, you pray prayers usually that are memorized, that are written by famous ancient saints and so on. And by using the image to visualize the object of your prayer, you enter into that person's presence. And the idea is, the theory of icons in Eastern Orthodox Christianity is that it brings you into, it's a formula which, if you follow it correctly, brings you into an experience of the divine. It's not just a ritual. It's not an empty act of obedience and devotion, but it's something that's supposed to give you the experience of being in the presence of Jesus, in the presence of the Trinity, and so on. And so I've got some pictures that are, I took these pictures from a variety of different churches with typical Byzantine images. Unlike, if you were raised Protestant, if you're familiar with a Protestant style of Christianity, going to places in Europe, places like Greece or Israel. These are pictures from Israel in churches in the West Bank in Palestinian territory, where in a lot of churches it's typical of the Byzantine style for every square inch of the entire place to be filled with images. The entire world, right? The ceiling is painted with images of Jesus and the saints and all of the characters that inhabit heaven. And then as you go down the walls, the ceiling is painted with the devil and sinners in hell, in flames and burning, right? And the idea is, you're supposed to enter into another world. It's supposed to be a different world. The Orthodox Christian bookstore down on Mendocino, perhaps you've seen it. Its title is, it's an Orthodox Christian bookstore. They sell icons and books of the kind that I've described. And the name of the bookstore is Not of This World, which is a reference to the way Orthodox Christians look at church and icons, which are supposed to be, if you do it right, windows into another world, into another reality, and a separate reality. And we're talking about something, an experience that's not unlike what Carlos Castaneda's talks about, a separate reality, right? So, just here's some more examples of them. These are all images that this is actually the tomb, the crypt of Saint Jerome, right? And so this is a cave church. This is in the basement of underneath the church, and it's a cave. It's Rhonda again, and me, and Mary and Jesus, and so on. Now, me, Rhonda, Mary, and Jesus.
Okay.
It's a family portrait. Anyway, Islam, in the Islamic tradition, I just wanted to give something that's a contrast. Muslims insist that it is an offense to God of the highest order to portray God. We're all probably painfully aware that this is a controversy around the world, where Muslims carry this extended even farther, so that it's not just an offense to God to portray God in a picture, but it's even an offense to portray the prophet of God, Muhammad, in a picture, right? So this is why in Islamic civilization, essentially sculpture, painting, anything that depicts a living thing is forbidden. And that's why in Islamic civilization, the art forms that developed and matured are calligraphy and architecture, right? And so on the mosque that was just in that last picture, the calligraphy, the written word, is beautiful, and that essentially does the same work for, a lot of Muslims who read and experience the Quran don't even understand the Arabic text, the language that it's in, right? But the words in beautiful writing give them that experience.
Could you go back to the, yeah. In many of the Islamic forms of mysticism, particularly in Sufism, the geometric forms and the calligraphy become the objects of meditation,
right,
just as Eric was describing the iconography,
right,
for the Eastern. Okay, I'm supposed to talk a little bit about meditation. Let me just say three things really, really quickly. Using the word meditation is like using the word love. What does that mean? It's a huge, huge range of things that we could talk about. Some of which have to do with the production of mystical experience, a lot which don't. And probably the only thing I want to say at this point is that when you actually look at the traditional Buddhist and Hindu forms of meditation, what they're about, for all practical purposes, is the ability to go deeper and deeper and deeper, trying to get to the essential self on one side and to cut off the outside world on the other. But those are just kind of two forms of meditation that you find among hundreds. In the Tibetan tradition, you find, I couldn't even list the number of different kinds of meditation, just as in the Theravadan tradition.
Yeah, what you see here is really, the two there, the arousing ones, the active ones, and the tranquil ones, and I think both are, separate ways.
So, and prayer, another, a pathway to experience is prayer, which usually Christians, actually, and Christians, Jews, people in the Western traditions experience prayer all kinds of different ways, right? Usually what is meant by prayer is something that is specific and organized, and often prayer takes place in a holy place. And so there are holy places. I have some shots here of monumental holy places, and there's a sign. I'm sorry, could you go back just one? This is the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, the Kotel. And it's what's left of the remnants of the Jewish temple, that part of the structure that was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. And there's a sign, there are many signs that kind of guide you in the experience of the Western Wall. And this is a pilgrimage. This is the principal holy site for Jews, right, in all over the world. And they come to pray and to experience something. And there's a plaque, which I didn't take a picture of, over there on the left side, which says that essentially it quotes a passage from Ezekiel, where Ezekiel talks about an ideal temple that will be built, and where the presence of God, the Shekhinah, is the Hebrew word. Shekhinah in the Bible refers to God's physical manifestation as a presence. And it will come and reside in the temple, and this is the spot, right? So the idea, the theory, is that Jews are coming here to the wall, to the place where you meet God, to the place where you meet God's visible presence, and ideally you might feel something, you might have that experience, right? And so here's it is again, very fuzzy, Russian Orthodox Jews. This is July, and it's 106 degrees, and they're wearing black and big fur hats, look like marshmallows. And this is Elijah's cave, another holy place. This is a sign on the wall. Here's a warning. This sign is at the entrance when you go into the one ramp where non-Muslims can go into the Temple Mount area. It's a sign that's directed at Jews, saying to them essentially, you really shouldn't go here. We don't want you to go in there. And this is the reason, because, according to Torah law. Really, this sign is relatively new. The main reason really is because Jews and Muslims mixing in each other's holy places has had a tendency to incite violence. So the next slide. Another thing that I encountered, I didn't really plan on in Israel, is the Baha'i Gardens. This is in Haifa. And the Baha'i is a world religion. It's one of the most widespread of all world religions. It's relatively recent. It's only a couple hundred years old. And it began in Iran. It's kind of a sort of an offshoot of Islam. It's most closely related to Islam. And the Baha'i have two holy places, and they are, both of them, they're the burial sites of the two main figures of the founding of the religion, and both of them are the most magnificent gardens that exist in the world, anywhere. They're, in all the books, and all the Guinness Book of World Records. This dominates the entire hill from the top of the hill in Haifa, the Carmel Ridge, all the way down to the beach. And it's just acres and acres and acres of gorgeous gardens. And it's the obligation of every Baha'i to contribute money for the upkeep of this garden. And no Baha'i are allowed to live in either city. The only two sacred cities are Haifa and Akko, which is just about 10 miles up the coast. And no Baha'i are allowed to live in those cities, but they come there. It's their main destination to go to a pilgrimage. And they come and pray, and there's inside this temple, there is no, visitors can go in, but the only condition is you have to leave your shoes outside, and you must not make a sound. And the idea is that it's an environment. It's a deliberate environment. It is for the purpose of prayer and meditation, and for the purpose of facilitating an experience. And that's another ceiling.
Yeah. Okay, the experience of nature. And I'm just going to say something cryptically that will make sense a little bit later. One of the things that being in nature allows us to do is basically shut off the left brain and activate the right brain, given all the stuff that Jürgen was talking about. What happened? Next one.
Dreams are next.
Okay, your dreams.
So, in dreams, we also at times, have mystical experience, extraordinary things. Let me just maybe give you...
Does that help?
Yeah.
Huh?
Why didn't we do this work here?
I don't know. I'm not responsible.
I had a dream, for example, in which I was killed, and I went through the bardos, and I had this mystical experience of going through different states of consciousness in that dream. That's a mystical experience in a dream. So dreams can, Jung would call these big dreams, dreams that, are important for your life and that teach you something.
Okay, one of the other aspects of the kinds of things that routinely can produce mystical experience, we've talked about things like fasting, and all of us, I think all three of us have had experiences with that, though it's been a long time for me. But ascetic practices, the Buddha went through a period of denying the body, and a large number of the Hindu traditions engage in ascetic practices. Back to this one. There's also some evidence, and this is a wonderful book I'd recommend to everybody called Holy Anorexia, that a fair number of the early Christian saints also practiced forms of ascetic experience, and perhaps were even anorexic. The body is a very common tool that's used, and again, in things like Hatha Yoga, where the body is used to create the experience. And also mortification of the body. In much of India, these are very, very common practices. And then sexual practices, the Tantra. The Tantra is both symbolic, meaning it's about the union of opposites, the union of the masculine and the feminine, but it's also a practice. In Taoist, the Taoist tradition, and also in the Tantric Indian tradition, you practice things like how long you can sustain intercourse. And, I'm very curious to see the effect that Viagra has had on the Tantra, because there are stories of the Taoist masters being able to sustain erections for days and days and days. I don't know if these are apocryphal stories or not. Learning to suck up your semen so that you ejaculate and then you suck the semen back. Now you sound, oh, no one can do that. I actually saw a sadhu take his penis and suck water back up. I mean, these are things that in the West, just, how many years did it take you to learn to do that one, and what? But it's all part of a very, very powerful tradition of relating mind and body, and then using mind and body as the vehicle for transcendence. And again, it's something that's hard for us to understand here. And again, this is the Yabyum. Now, one of the questions, so we've seen all these different practices. What do they have in common? Why is it that, and again, this is gross oversimplification, but why is it that fasting on one side, penetrating your body with needles on the other, prayer on the other, dreaming on the other, produces very similar states? Well, there's a wonderful, I don't know, was anthropologist, Winckelmann, an anthropologist, who has suggested that what all these states have in common is what they produce. And what they produce is exactly what Jürgen was talking about earlier. They produce a synchronization of brain function and an integration of brain function. And it's shown up in things like the EEGs, the electroencephalograms, producing theta waves that are highly slowed but synchronized brain waves, and the production of serotonin, very particular serotonin pathways. And so Winckelmann believes that there's a reason that we do all these practices in terms of coming to some fairly common end experiences. So serotonin, for those of you who don't know, that's a neurotransmitter, and then these are what theta waves look like. Kind of our normal, everyday, just being alert is beta, alpha, relaxed, and then theta is this state that's very commonly associated with deep meditation and mystical states.
Okay. Maybe just very quickly, people have speculated, is there any similarity in the personalities who have these mystical experiences? One hypothesis, well, they're fantasy-prone individuals who seem to be particularly hypnotizable, who, if you go look a little bit further down, they frequently report clairvoyant experiences, telepathy, precognition, automatic writing, out-of-body experiences. Now, the interesting thing about them is there's no psychopathology there. They're well-adjusted, they cope with their everyday life just like everybody else. One of the questionnaires to try to investigate mystical experiences, to what extent do people either believe in mystical experiences, believe in miracles, etc., etc.? Now, what they found with the help of these questionnaires is they seem to cluster in families. And twin studies show that about 37 to 50% of the variation in spirituality seems to be explained by genes, which means that 50 to 63% are not explained by genes. So there is a genetic component in terms of the gift that is a part of this. We could look at other personality traits, which I've listed there, but I won't go through these or discuss them at this moment.
Okay, Carl Jung, and you're going to, again, this is almost the trouble with this topic is that any one of the things we brought up this evening, we could spend the entire evening on. And it's kind of interesting to see what it's like to steamroll through this. But Carl Jung has developed a certain kind of resurgence with the, next slide, Jürgen, with the publication of the Red Book. And Jürgen and I have worked together looking at the Red Book. And basically, what I think much of the history of psychology has ignored is that what Jung was really most fundamentally interested in was union, was connection, was basically getting the ego and the self to interact in such a way that you could have spiritual experiences. Now, the Red Book turns out to be the diary, the log of his journey in a very brief part of his life, trying to basically meet this deeper world.
And, what he's doing is in many ways is shamanic. He has or it could have happened, in the desert in Israel. He has these profound conversations with these spirits, these other beings. And it is like, an everyday conversation. So I'm just going to read you a very brief example. He introduces it by saying, "Am I dreaming or am I awake? It's hot. The sun already stands high. How the hours pass. Truly, the morning is nearly over, and how astonishing it has been. Is it the sun, or is it these living stones, or is it the desert that makes my head buzz? I go up the valley, and before long I reach the hut of the anchorite. The anchorite is somebody who has secluded himself from society to kind of a monk. He is sitting on his mat, lost in deep reflection. I say, 'My father, I am here. How have you spent your morning? I was surprised when you said yesterday, the time passes quickly for you. I don't question you anymore, and this will no longer surprise me. I've learned a lot, but only enough to make you an even greater riddle than you were before. Why all the things that you must experience in the desert, you wonderful man? Even the stones are bound to speak to you. I'm happy,' says the anchorite, 'that you have learned to understand something of the life of an anchorite.'" And it goes on from there, and you can see, these are very lively dialogues, and like they have their own reality, these other beings. They're there, they're present for him, and he engages with them, just like we would over a latte in a coffee house.
Yeah. He has a spirit guide. This is Philemon, who was his spirit guide in the beginning of the explorations. Why the Red Book was just recently published is the family held on to it because they had the belief that if people read this stuff, they'd think that Jung was totally nuts, that he was totally crazy, that he was working so outside the cultural box. Now, one of the things that he talks about is what happens when the self confronts the hidden world, the spirit world, the larger world. And one of the things he says is that you get a really interesting response because it is so powerful. It is so overwhelming that oftentimes the ego, which is our everyday personalities, the ego becomes dramatically inflated. And so one of the things that you begin to see when you look at spiritual teachers, when you look at historically the charismatic leaders, they all have these massive, massive egos. And Jung, for me, gives the first explanation of that because it's so intense when you encounter this other world that the ego can become dramatically inflated. And we'll see that a little bit when we talk about the origin of religion.
A lot of native traditions actually counter that with humor.
Yeah.
And teasing you.
Yeah, I just picking up. I love the Native American tradition of humor. Generally speaking, in the desert religions, you don't find a lot of that. Seriously, there are a couple of different kind of parallel themes. I'm staring into blue. I'm having a mystical experience right now. The blue light.
The blue light experience.
The blue light reminds me of. No, never mind. There are two themes, two really different trends in the literature and the discourse in Western desert religions. And one stream is that the mystics in the traditions are revered. They are as I've already said, in the desert traditions, there are dramatic, mystical encounters with the other world, encounters with God, that lie at the foundation of each of the traditions, right? Essentially, the founding stories for Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Mormonism, all of them rely on basic narratives that are the foundation stories, with the encounters, direct encounters with God, Abraham, Moses, Paul, Muhammad, Joseph Smith, and so on. A lot of these, my observation, and I'm speaking now as a biblical scholar, not as a psychologist. I had college courses in psychology, but I haven't done a lot of systematic or disciplined study of personality. But one of the things that I've always observed about to the extent that personality shines through in these traditions, I've sometimes, even when I was within and a passionate member and believer within one of these communities, I found that in looking at the personality that shines through, most of them, they're not someone I would hang out with. They're not someone I would pursue as a friend. And I just pick up and extend a little bit Scott's observation about ego. And frankly, I'm not sure. To me, it's an open question. I wonder which precedes which. Paul, if you read Paul's letters, he has this dramatic experience narrated and sort of at the foundation of, and a lot of people who are Christians refer back to this experience as sort of the proof positive. It's second to Jesus' resurrection of the doctrines, the dogmata, as we mentioned that tonight was not about. But Paul's letters are loaded with ego, loaded with fighting, with putting down his rivals, with insulting and degrading those who teach a different doctrine than he does. He uses violent language. He uses scatological language. And he seems to me to be, in his letters, sometimes simply a megalomaniac. Muhammad looks the same way. Joseph Smith looks the same way. And so a lot of these, as the writings developed, if there's enough of a history where you have development over a couple of decades, which you do in the case of all the ones that I've mentioned, you see a development where there's an initial mystical experience which sort of justifies then in the future everything else that they might do. And at the end of their careers, all of them tended to be power-grabbing, megalomaniacal kinds of personalities. And so I don't know what to make of it. I don't think that there's an essential connection between mystical experiences and that kind of personality, because you also have people that are mystics and that we have a lot of information about that are the opposite, that they're completely outside the mainstream and they critique and depart from the normal paradigm, the master narrative, right? But many of them, I guess it kind of depends which way they tend, depends on whether they're inside or outside the basic structures of orthodoxy. For example, I'm thinking of just one more. I'm thinking of the Sufis, for example, and I have a collection of Sufi writings. And one of the things that is interesting about Sufis, the Sufi tradition is something that developed in Islam fairly early on, and the Sufis were inspired by the mystical nature of Muhammad's founding experiences and so on. And so Sufis within Islamic tradition developed a mystical style of being Muslim, but they also developed similarly to Tantra, right? Yeah. They just like Tantra has a right hand and a left hand, the Sufis had a sober and a drunk right? And so Sufis often were spoken of and spoke of themselves as either a drunk Sufi or a sober Sufi. There's two different styles. And the sober Sufis were the ones that were a little bit more sedate, a little bit more, well-behaved and suitable for a G-rated setting, right? Whereas drunken Sufis were after the same thing. And they both understood, sober Sufis and drunk Sufis, both understood each other to be after the same thing, which was, they would describe as union with God, as a throwing off of all the trappings of form and self and a union with God. But they went about it different ways, and the drunk Sufis were entirely outside of the mainstream of the orthodox structures, and one of the results of that was that many of them were killed. They were stoned to death by angry mobs in the streets of Baghdad and other places because they were so out there. Well, one famous Sufi, for example, went around the streets, according to the stories about him, he just took off his clothes one day in the middle of Baghdad and went around saying, "I am Allah." Right? I'm Allah. And they killed him. Go figure, right? And so you have these different ways that mystics play in terms of the established structures of the Orthodox religion.
I think we should push forward and then just open up to discussion. I think let's not do this and let's just go to, I think, there.
Yeah.
I want to show you a little bit about how mystical experience and cultural values play together. And are most of you familiar with Janie Goodall? Let me see hands. Famous primatologist. And in the 1970s, she had a profound religious experience, okay? She was in Notre Dame Cathedral, and as she describes it, light came in through the rose window, and they were playing a Bach. Will that go off? They were playing Bach's Toccata and Fugue, and the whole world opened up. Well, let's take a look at her describing this.
People came, you married and had a son, many students were there.
Including you.
Including me. You published
This is Richard Wrangham, by the way, anthropologist at Harvard, who's got a book out now called Catching Fire. I don't know if you've heard of it.
It was not until many years later, in 1974, that something very special happened, which was that you were in France, in Notre Dame Cathedral, and you had a return of some of the great spiritual feelings that you'd had earlier in your life. What had happened in the intervening time? Had you forgotten them, or what was the change going on here in your life?
Well, I think the times alone in the forest, I very much had the sense of this great spiritual power. It was there, it was all around. It was actually present in the forest and in the beings that lived in the forest, as well as being present in me. So I wasn't actually debating about it. I wasn't consciously thinking it through, but it was there. So that when I looked back, I realized what had been going on. So that when I went into Notre Dame, it was after a difficult period of my life. The divorce was happening, and it was just so amazing to walk into that wonderful cathedral where I'd always wanted to go. And the sun was just shining through that beautiful rose window. Have you been there?
No.
You have to now, don't you? And just like, as though it was being orchestrated by some divine power, the great organ sprang into life. Just as I walked in and looked up at that window, it was a wedding, which was way off in some corner, and it was playing Bach's Toccata and Fugue in G minor, and it was just so beautiful. And it just hit me all of a sudden, how can this be chance? The whole amazing cathedral, the beautiful music, the mind that made it, that sort of feeling of, what you get in an ancient cathedral, that so many people have prayed there and had their thoughts and their feelings and their fears and their joys there. That was all around. And my mind that could suddenly, in an instant, comprehend the whole sort of span of evolution and question, why are we here, and is there a purpose, and is there a reason, and is this moment something that's meant to be important for me? And so this really brought everything back into its old original place.
Okay, so what you see there is profound experience, huh? Music, light, context, cathedral, and then her personal and cultural narrative put together with that. Now, the argument I would make, just really quickly, is that spiritual experiences are fairly common. I think what the psychologist Maslow talked about with peak experiences, some of you have experienced it listening to music, you've experienced it in nature. You don't necessarily attribute it to being religious, okay? In fact, it may just go in passing and unnoticed. But imagine those experiences becoming more and more and more intense and what that becomes like. And then imagine that you've got a narrative that fits that experience, as she did. She grew up in a religious family.
Okay, just very quickly, just some catchword here. We have touched upon it. We'll touch upon it again. When we are, focused on rationality and dismiss these experiences because they're difficult to research, they're difficult to validate, to verify. When we inflate them and inflate our ego about it, that's all something that is discouraging or inhibiting mystical experiences. When they are privileged and only certain people can have them, who are up in the hierarchy, or when we are pathologizing, and we'll deal with pathology and madness in a minute.
Should we just go through this? I mean,
Yes.
just skip it. Skip
Yes.
over it.
Sure.
Yeah. I'm just really worried about time.
Yeah.
Okay. Neurotheology. Now, because of time and constraints, oh, shit. I should really, yeah. I'm just going to go through this really, really quickly, and then later, if you guys want to come back to it. Basically, in the last 20 years, there's been the advent of a whole bunch of tools for studying the brain while the brain is, you can go through this while I'm talking, while the brain is in process. One is using very sophisticated electroencephalographs. We talked a little bit about that, about mystical experiences producing theta waves. The other is the use of things like PET scans. And what they do is they inject you with a radioactive form of glucose, and then the parts of the brain that are active absorb that glucose at a much faster rate than the parts of the brain that are not active. And so they've developed all kinds of ways of studying what's happening in the brain while things are going on. All right? Now, one of the claims, and I think Jürgen set the stage for this perfectly, is that mystical experiences are nothing more than either malfunctionings of the brain or epiphenomena of certain forms of brain activity. And as Jürgen mentioned earlier, central to understanding the brain is the fact that we have two cerebral hemispheres, okay, connected by this huge bundle of nerves called the corpus callosum. And that's what allows the brain to act in an integrated fashion. Now, what you see very basically is that the right hemisphere that controls the left side of the body is the brain that is associated with religious experience. And the left hemisphere controlling the right side of the body is the brain that is associated with discursive logic, thought, and all of that. Now, when you actually go through a list of the words that describe right hemispheric function, what you see is that those are the same words that describe mystical experiences. Okay, next one. So, there was this gal, hopefully some of you know about her, Jill Botte Taylor. She became one of Oprah's cause celebs. and she had a massive stroke, and that stroke gave her a religious epiphany. Now, where'd she have the stroke? She had the stroke in her left cerebral hemisphere. So all those language functions, those dominant functions that Jürgen was talking about earlier, were shut down. Here's her description of that experience.
My headache was just getting worse.
Yeah,
so
she's
I
a
get off the machine,
neuropsychologist.
and I'm walking across my living room floor, and I realize that everything inside of my body has slowed way down. And every step is very rigid and very deliberate. There's no fluidity to my pace, and there's this constriction in my area of perception, so I'm just focused on internal systems. And I'm standing in my bathroom getting ready to step into the shower, and I could actually hear the dialogue inside of my body. I heard a little voice saying, okay, you muscles, you got to contract, and you muscles, you relax. And then I lost my balance, and I'm propped up against the wall. And I looked down at my arm, and I realized that I can no longer define the boundaries of my body. I can't define where I begin and where I end, because the atoms and the molecules of my arm blended with the atoms and molecules of the wall. And all I could detect was this energy. And I'm asking myself, what is wrong with me? What is going on? And in that moment, my brain chatter, my left hemisphere brain chatter, went totally silent. Just like someone took a remote control and pushed the mute button. Total silence. And at first I was shocked to find myself inside of a silent mind. But then I was immediately captivated by the magnificence of the energy around me.
Doesn't that
And because I
sound
could
familiar?
no longer identify the boundaries of my body, I felt enormous and expansive. I felt at one with all the energy that was, and it was beautiful there. And then all of a sudden, my left hemisphere comes back online, and it says to me, hey, we got a problem, we got to get some help. And I'm going, oh, I got a problem. So it's like, okay, I got a problem. But then I immediately drifted right back out into the consciousness, and I affectionately refer to this space as La La Land.
Okay, Jürgen,
But it was beautiful there.
That's probably enough. So what you begin to see then is maybe what these experiences are is the shutting down of the left hemisphere. Okay, because when you do that, then you get the kind of experiences she's describing. Now, another version of the story of neurotheology is the temporal lobe, both left and right. And V.S. Ramachandran, who's at UCSD, did a study of people with temporal lobe epilepsy. And about 30% of the people who have temporal lobe epilepsy experience God, experience the presence, experience mystical revelation. And so Ramachandran wrote up his stuff, and the press got hold of it, and they started talking about the God spot. And Ramachandran will be the first to tell you it's not one spot, but that this process, for not everyone, but about 30% of the people who have temporal lobe epilepsy, produce the same kind of experiences that you find in mystical revelation. He then did something really interesting. GSRs are like lie detector tests, galvanic skin response. He took a whole bunch of highly religious people, and he took his patients that had temporal lobe epilepsy that were having these religious experiences, and he showed them words. And what he found was the temporal lobe people responded to religious words the same way that you and I respond to words around sex. Meaning they went off the charts with the GSR, where you and I would go off the charts with sexual words. They went off the charts with religious words. And again, what he discovered was that there was this profound sensitivity that these people had to things related to religion. By the way, the normal religious believers, they responded just like you and I. Almost no GSR response to God, and a lot of GSR response to sex. Second guy that's done a lot of work with the temporal lobes, and this in some ways is the most interesting guy, is a guy named Michael Persinger, who's up in Canada. And what Persinger did was he used basically magnetic stimulation of the brain over the temporal lobes, and was able in about 80% of his subjects to produce some kind of religious response. Mostly the sense of a presence, okay, like I experienced in Assisi, right? But something that was vaguely religious. He then went on to develop a helmet that, basically influenced the magnetic structures, and then started studying people's responses as he developed different magnetic frequencies. And again, the temporal lobe was central in that. So this is now where the neurosciences are kind of honing in. One of the most interesting stories is, this is Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins, for those of you that follow the kind of scientific side of the critiques of religion, is probably one of the big three. Huh? He's right up there. And his book, The God Delusion, is just a savage attack on religion. So Dawkins says, I got to see what all these people are talking about. So he volunteers, goes to Persinger's lab, okay? Nothing happens. Nothing. I mean, nothing, right? Heard interviews with Dawkins. He's really disappointed. He said, I want to experience it. I want to experience it, right? Nothing happens. Persinger says, I'm not surprised. It turns out that there's differential susceptibility to temporal lobe phenomena, with the most susceptible people being the epileptics up on one side and people like Dawkins down at the bottom. And so it starts to get into this question, are we differentially wired to have these experiences? And the answer is probably yes. Okay, next. And then, next slide. The guy who's probably the leading researcher now in neurotheology is this guy, Andrew Newberg, and he's got a bunch of books. The most recent one that just came out a couple of weeks ago, Principles of Neurotheology. And Newberg uses the most sophisticated, next slide, most sophisticated techniques. And what he's discovered is, when I think about the ways that mystical experience has been described, we go all the way back to Stace, who described basically the kind of introverted and extroverted ways, that is, the experiences of the loss of self and the experiences of connection and the experiences of present. Temporal lobe stuff produces experiences of presence and connection. Parietal lobe, which is up here, very close to where your motor strip is, produces sensations about loss of self, loss of body. So this is what Newberg is interested in exploring. Next slide. The temporal lobe is also very closely connected to the emotional centers. In fact, the amygdala sits inside the inner portion of the temporal lobe. So you would expect that activities that are going in the temporal lobe are going to have profound emotional consequences. And so Newberg then has done a whole bunch of studies of prayer and meditation. And basically, next slide, what he's discovered is that, and this is what you would expect, just as we know there are different kinds of meditation that are experienced differently, he's found brain signatures that correspond to these. So all of a sudden, it helps us start to play with, well, if it's just subjective experience, and when I say I'm feeling bliss and you're feeling bliss, how do we know we're talking about the same things? Well, it gets a little closer if you find out that what? You're stimulating the same parts of the brain. So, for example, this is a SPEC scan is again, it's using radioisotopes, basically. And what he discovered was that in Tibetan monks, that there's an increase in the attention area, because much of Buddhist meditation is focused on what? On dramatically increasing your attention. Next slide. But that what falls away is your orientation, meaning your awareness of body and what's going on around you. Now, this will vary because there are certain forms of Zazen where that area actually dramatically increases. So what we're starting to find now is that we're developing a whole vocabulary to be able to talk about the different forms of meditation and what's going on in the brain. Now, the next one I think Eric's going to like, all right? He looked at prayer, and he looked at Franciscan nuns at prayer, and like you would expect, there was an increase in the language areas, all right, compared to baseline, because they're concentrating on their prayers. Next slide. But that the orientation area, which is here, I didn't get my little pointer, right, dramatically declined. So what you've got now are people concentrating on their prayers, but again, like in meditation, the orientation part is disappearing. Okay, next slide. Now, the other one that's interesting, worship here, I finally read the article, what this refers to is he took people, Pentecostals, who spoke in tongues, and he said, okay, I want to see what you look like when you're not speaking in tongues. So just kind of do like, singing some songs and dancing around, but not in tongues, all right? And so what he got was that, and this only makes sense when you compare it to the next slide, what he got was that when they started speaking in tongues, okay, Jürgen, next slide, there is a dramatic decline in the use of the frontal cortex, the planning part. And if we could go just back and forth a minute, and if you could just concentrate up here, just quickly go back and forth. See the blue area with speaking in tongues increases? What that means is these folks are going on automatic pilot, which is that's what they're reporting. So what neurotheology is now doing is giving a unbelievably sophisticated way to check on what's happening in people's phenomenological descriptions of what's occurring. That's why a lot of us are really excited about this. The problem, and it goes back to all those critiques that Jürgen put up, the problem is the materialists are saying, see, it's just brain problems. It's just brain melt. And that's what Dawkins thinks, and Steve Pinker, all these guys think. So it's a fascinating area, and it's an area that is literally exploding right now. And I would highly recommend that you guys take a look at it.
So I actually don't know if we should do the next section because of time. We have half an hour. And
we have half an hour. Why don't we just go to questions?
Yeah, let's
I think that's what we should do.
Yeah.
Boy, did we overbook.
Yeah. We have enough material for a semester.
Yeah, we figured after we did this, we had enough material for a semester. Yeah, lights?
So, I mean, there's so much more to say, but what do you think? Questions, comments? Is it mystical experiences, brain, more than brain? Okay, let's do it. Roxanne.
Oh, I think they can, and I think that's why it's so important to sort of recover the bridging of the two and the integration of the other side. I mean, one of the things that is noteworthy about, the people who dealt with whatever the sacred text and the writings, many of those are stories which are not rationality in the same way that we're looking at science, but, they're metaphorical, they're poetic, etc., these scriptures. So they actually, even though they're a left brain, they really keep the connection to the right brain very open by the way in which they are written.
I don't know who was first. By tantric experiences, could you unpack that a little bit for me?
Out there in the wheat fields and sees 11-year-old girls or 14-year-old girls, and all of a sudden God descends.
Sexual.
Yes.
Yeah. That's at the time. That's a good and informed question. At the time, that was what a lot of, perhaps most of Joseph Smith's detractors said. Exactly that. I think that it comes into it at least fairly early in the whole story, but I'm not sure if that is its origin or if that is only its origin. Joseph Smith. One of the things that's interesting is that one of the earliest scholarly biographies of Joseph Smith developed a thesis which has since borne out as being very well supported by the immense paper trail, is that the stories of visitations by angels, by Jesus and the Father and so on, were preceded by versions of the story in which it wasn't angels or Jesus, it was a ghost of a Spanish pirate who was telling him where to find buried treasure. Right? So I mean, from what I've read about the earliest accounts of people who knew Joseph Smith that were published in newspapers at the time that the Book of Mormon was first published, the theme of money and treasure hunting is more dominant than the sexual theme, but that comes into it later. So that's generally what it seems to me to be. Is that I think that if there's something like that feeding it, that it's the money first and then the sex later. I just want to add to that, in my mother's religion, which she still practices, she still follows, basically the interesting thing is that the goal ultimately of every mystic or psychic encounter or event is love or money. How to succeed, whether you will succeed in business, money, sex.
I wanted to, when we talked about madness, what was that topic about?
Madness? Well, I'll say something. Go ahead. I'll say something. Do you guys want to say something?
Yeah, I'll say something.
Okay. Well, I'll just very quickly, I will say that that the mystical experiences that I study and that some of these I've talking about my own experience. I've had experiences like this. I think that they're very precariously close to madness. Often, they're very precariously close to madness. And sometimes the most extreme of them might be indistinguishable from madness. Short answer.
Yeah, that's the, when, for example, shamanic initiation, which is very often, when you read the description, if any Western psychiatrist were to see that person, they would lock them up in the psychiatry, right? I mean, they don't take care of themselves. They they don't function very well in everyday life, but they go through that as a period, which we now call spiritual emergence, or if it doesn't go so well, spiritual emergency. So, but what they manage to do, and this is very different. It's very different from schizophrenia or any of those things. Is they find a way to integrate those experiences. And these experiences are, when you listen to a schizophrenic, one of the symptoms is the cognitive malfunction, the thought disorder. Well, shamans, it all ends up being a story or experiences that hang together. That there are visionary experiences, and they end up functioning very well in everyday life while the schizophrenic deteriorates. So there are these experiences as we go through them that are very close to madness, and the challenge is, are we equipped? Do we have the background, whatever the personal resilience, whatever it is, to actually integrate these experiences? Or do these experiences become so overpowering that we disintegrate under the onslaught of those experiences, which is, where the role of, say, skillful teachers, practices, instructions, and all of that comes in, or a cultural container like in shamanism, where you have a tradition of how that's actually done. Yeah.
And this can be transient. I mean, the things we call madness are part of our cultural narrative, and they include transient conditions. I saw a few hands on this side. I don't remember who was first. Carrie, you had your hand up. Did you? Okay.
Yeah, I mean that's a known sports and mystical experiences. There is the runner's high. So there are experiences, or people have the mountain climbing, where they get into a high and have a mystical experience and experience what Jane Goodall described, a union. There it was Bach and Notre Dame, and but it can be the Sierras. It can. Well, that's, I think, I would distinguish in the definition between spirituality and religion. Spirituality really focuses on the experiences, and like Maslow would call that a peak experience, when you have a runner's high, which does not need any interpretation in terms of any religious book or dogma, or any belief system that goes with it. By the way, the focus is on the experience, and those are significant experiences.
If you think of these things as on a continuum, and again, sports is great. If you're a Giants fan right now, or you've had a winning football team, and if you've gone to a stadium, the collective spirit. You ever look at pictures of Nazi rallies? Now, be careful here about not going, but that there's something that human beings do collectively, with ritual, with collective mind. And what it has in common with spiritual experience, it's not the disintegration, but the loss of self. And you experience that, and it can be an unbelievable high. So if you see these things on a continuum, where these are the everyday versions, okay, right, that when they're intensified, get translated to another realm. Because hopefully most of us recognize, this is an everyday thing, as opposed to, oh my God, this is really an unusual thing.
I would emphatically say, I think atheists have these same kinds of experiences that we're talking about, and they just simply never do interpret them in religious language. Dawkins may be one of those people that just never has, but there's no necessary. The thing that the horse I'm going to ride is, I don't think there's any necessary connection between the experiences we're talking about and any particular religious idea, and it doesn't have to be connected to already being, right?
which relates to some fundamental research, is that we experience an arousal which we can label differently. Different people label the same kind of physiological arousal differently.
Right. Okay. Well, can I just let's just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. Can you go by your number? I'm sorry. Okay, 1.
Jürgen mentioned at the beginning that there perhaps are some traits that we're seeing emerge evolutionarily in our current world or in cultural pockets, I don't know, that are pointing to something new. And I want to address that. And also, shamanism strikes me as being more of a service to another human, or there's more of there's a presence of an other in the human world that you're doing something for. There's an intentionality there that's different from some of these other paradigms we've been looking at. Would you just briefly say something?
Well, we can take the response to the Red Book as an indication that the interest it generated. I think there are these indicators. I don't think it's a huge tidal wave. But I think just even that Newberg is doing all this research on this stuff. So I think it is just very persistent because science has sort of tried to make it go away and reduce it to just a materialist interpretation, and that just isn't working. So there's sort of this persistent grind, because it keeps being important for us because it's an aspect of humanity, that we have these kinds of experiences. There are human potential, and I think it's sort of knocking a little bit louder, at the door. I think, the intention of some of this is very different. Some people are, satisfied and they do the work for themselves. Some people who have spontaneous mystical experiences, they actually after that or as part of that increase their service to others. With shamanism, within a community, within an indigenous society, there's a clear, dedication to service. So part of that also relates to, sort of the interpretation of what these experiences mean. And in shamanism, it means, well, you should be of service. If you have a special gift, then part of that is you make that special gift available to others. But I think also those societies have specialists who would just go out there into these realities for the sake of knowledge.
People with epilepsy, I specifically know someone with epilepsy, and he describes it as before he has a seizure, they're not like grand mal seizures, but he feels like he goes into a state of deja vu. And I was wondering if that could be called like a mystical experience, because he says like at times he'll feel like that he's relived this moment, or he feels, I guess, the spirit, like his mother's passed through something, he feels like his mother's presence, or like something with him, or like somebody is, sometimes he just says he feels like somebody has put a hand on him. So I'm just wondering if, like, I guess I want to know more about this like epilepsy and spirituality and how that goes together. Does everybody with epilepsy have these things?
It's not all epilepsy, it's specifically temporal lobe. But the experience, if what you were describing there is presence, that's associated with temporal lobe epilepsy. But that's just one piece. I mean, I think I have to think about this, is that this is a real complex puzzle to decode, and you would have to know a lot more about his experience to even begin to map it on what you might want to call or not call a spiritual experience. Other than if he was experiencing presence, that's a part of this mix that you find somewhere.
And I think, it's really important to remember what we said at the beginning. These experiences can start out with mind stuff, meaning intention, prayer, sitting down, intending something, and they can start out with, a heart attack, a brain tumor, something, or epilepsy. So, there are all these different ways that can bring about the experience or any combination, of these factors.
That's an interesting connection for me. I have to think about that. It's also the case that a lot of founders of religions got their revelations out on the sickbed. There are many who were desperately sickly, and these kinds of things sick with various kinds of ailments.
Okay, so this is going to be kind of a lengthy question. So my relation to the word madness relates back to insanity. And insanity to me would be when someone discovers that their beliefs conflict with their actions, and because the mind has to justify what the body does in order to live in accordance with itself. So I'm kind of curious as to when you're showing like the images of the brain, the context of insanity in relation to spirituality. Is that because someone is rediscovering how like that conflict between beliefs and actions is interacting? Sorry, this question's kind of complicated.
I don't know.
Well, you see, when we see these things going on in the brain, we still don't have any idea what they're actually thinking, right? Or what the actual imagery is, or what their intention at that second may be, right? I mean, we just know what happens in the brain, but their motivation, their thought, we don't see,
You mentioned the serotonin connection, and I'm wondering about the chemistry of the brain. You glossed over that lightly. Have they been doing some research on the serotonin connection? You also mentioned, someone with sports mentioned that it brings up the serotonin level, and I'm wondering about this, especially with the drug ecstasy.
The very quick bottom line about these neurotransmitters is that the research is inconclusive at this point, that there isn't a clear pattern. But the serotonin is, definitely one of the things that is in the mix.
We had a couple more and then a new wave. I forget who was.
No, that was a new way.
Oh, you're in the new wave? Who was?
I'm new wave, not old wave.
Okay, who was the old wave? I think you two, I think were old wave.
Oh, I just more had a comment question. I guess one of the difficulties I've had in talking with people more from the Western tradition, or maybe they're a little more dogmatic, they have some experiences with much more dogmatic than I am. It seems there's a big difference between, depending on the person, between like you were mentioning the Western, the desert traditions, there is the focus on the relational experience, and the East traditions, it's more of the the introverted experience. So there's a party of the focuses between East and Western traditions in that sense. So I just found when I saw that defined, it helped me think about how that's part of my difficulty in dialoguing with people, because I've had more of the introverted experience, and some people just can't, they don't, it's just not, they can't relate to it. Because they're caught in this notion. It's like almost an impossibility that it could be real.
Right.
The experience is real. That's more.
Right, and I mean, I'm impressed by how often it looks to me like those are basically assumptions, cultural baggage that set up. We are conditioned culturally to have certain expectations and to admit certain possibilities, and we don't allow others.
Right.
And that's part of our cultural conditioning, it seems to me.
Yeah, I would like to ask if you could go over the last of Eric's slides, because I feel like they were kind of glossed over in the presentation.
With
Your last few ones that you had?
Which ones are you talking about?
The ones that you glossed over, were those yours?
No, those were mine. Those were about madness.
Yeah. Crossed over probably about 70.
Yeah.
Because we had enough to fill 6 hours. Right. Were you
Just
interested in a particular idea, T?
I think I was just interested in what the slides
Just very briefly, at least, and I'm happy to talk with you later more. When people have these experiences that border on whatever madness, people have tried to diagnose them as schizophrenics. They've tried to say epilepsy, experience everything. It's something in the brain. People have said now, the latest is it's bipolar, or it's a dissociative disorder. So people, in order to deal with these strange phenomena, have used, especially with the dominance of the left brain, to say, well, that's pathological. That's not what we normally experience. And so these categories were used, and very often, they were used actually early on by anthropologists who were not psychologists, who saw some strange behavior and said, well, that looks like a crazy person, so that person must be schizophrenic because he's kind of having these weird movements and looks a little dirty and unkempt and doesn't seem to cope, While, all the psychological research since shows that, shamans are very well adjusted, they're very capable in their societies and very successful in their societies.
Running out of time. Go ahead.
The one thing that I, just during the whole presentation that I found quite interesting was the idea of the organized religions and the idea of spirituality and mystical. And then we started talking about the neurotransmitters in the brain, and yet how many things can feel very similar to us. These experiences feel similar, but what reacts them makes them different. I mean, again, we all, one people like Star Wars, people like Star Trek, there are things that make us different in what we appreciate can be. So is it possible, or could you say that organized religions might hinder the ability to have mystical experiences because they themselves have very devout sections of what they can do, and they can't go further into other fields because they are organized religions?
I would say in a word, yeah. I think that the one of the things that as a Pentecostal, I did 8 years as a Pentecostal, and one of the things that I didn't admit to too many people is that mystical, tremendous, out-of-body, tremendous experiences were expected and institutionalized and socialized, and I never had them. As long as anybody was watching, and as long as it was in a group, I never had them. I could do it. I could speak in tongues. I can speak in tongues for you now, but I'm not going to. I spoke in tongues. I spoke in tongues every day for years and years and years, and that's exactly what it was. It's just simply. I think that the phenomenon is basically like what babies do before they master a language. It's kind of a babbling thing, but it's a neutral. It's almost like it's just a putting on neutral, but you're completely aware. And I mean, at least I never experienced it. I didn't know anybody who ever experienced anything. But the thing that I didn't often was afraid to tell my Pentecostal compatriots was that if I felt transcendent experiences, it was when I was in the mountains alone, not when I was in church. I never felt it in church. And I generally thought that the way church was, especially with the expectations of it, squelched it. It made it basically impossible to have. That was my experience.
Which goes back to what you said earlier about, there's a right experience and a wrong experience and a particular expectation, so that, makes it difficult to be spontaneous and let experiences happening, because there's this filter.
There might be differences, there might be similarities. I mean, I see them right away, the way you frame it, I see them as a Venn diagram.
Right? Me too. That's what I'm wondering about.
I mean, my experience, I began my introduction by talking about my Pentecostal experience, my mother's psychic mystical experiences. I had a third one, drugs. psychedelic drugs, and they're very similar, right? In fact, the only time I've really sought out a pathway which was aimed to produce a particular kind of mystical experience, the only one that worked reliably was drugs.
So, I mean, there are two factors in there, that I think are important. I mean, one is, how are you able to integrate those experiences, whatever it is? And the other part is really, it goes back to the cultural impact. If you go to a psychiatrist and say, like Jung might have said, I talked to that spirit the other day, you get a diagnosis, right? In a native society, and I'm simplifying and exaggerating here to make this point, but in a native society, if you don't see spirits, there's something wrong with you, right? Which relates to the whole discussion about the right, left brain and all that kind of stuff.
Before somebody else asks, can I just ask what you meant about having a right or a wrong experience? How can you define one as wrong?
Well, I think, I think what Eric was talking about is there are particular experiences that are seen as desirable and that get validated, right? Like you speak in tongues, right?
But if I want to get an experience, I want to have this, I desire to have these experiences because maybe I believe that can happen, is that considered wrong if I have one?
No,
Within
no,
that cultural community
no.
you're talking about, the cultural community sees it wrong, and that's one of the points of our outline was the things that inhibit experiences, and that's your experiences are inhibited. What we're saying is that your experiences can be inhibited by a community's expectations, by a cultural community's expectations, right? They say it's wrong.
So, yeah, I mean, I give you an example. I've been to Sweat Lodge with this medicine man, and the way he framed things was, you see certain spirits, and you see them in colors, and each color means a particular spirit, right? So people start watching out for colors, right? I mean, it's just as simple as that. So that emphasizes that, and that's what mostly people talk about, right? Because this color means the eagle, this color means the buffalo, et cetera, right? So that becomes selective in terms of what gets emphasized and what is, so to speak, a right experience. That's what I was referring to within that system, that gets validated. And I'm sure people have lots of other experiences there too, right?
Let's see. Who hasn't spoken yet?
What I think is really interesting is, one, how stoked you guys are, and how this could have gone on for hours. And the fact that, and also I think part of what's interesting is the cultural context. Because 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago, this discussion would not have happened. And so the question I have, and specifically relating to the things that Jürgen said, was just how our culture in general does not provide context, an acceptable context for this kind of experience. And so there's this double thing that's set up in anyone who has these things, and especially if you have the kind of wiring where you're especially susceptible to them, is that they pick you up and shake you. There's no denying these things happen, and quite often they're profound and they're have this beautiful sort of constancy to them, and yet there's no place to put them. But I think it sounds like sort of where we're headed is having a place to put them. And the fact that you guys have so much energy around this is very interesting.
A place to put it in different cultures, so that's well put. I like that. A place to put them. Yeah.
Speaking about the right and left brain and how the left is very dominant in modern society now, that it reminds that I work with autistic youth, and it reminds me of the fact that they are very left brain and very literal, and they don't have a lot of this artistic ability to write the left brain, and it just brings up so many significant.
Interesting.
Yeah. Good. Well, I was just saying, have you watched the movie The Horse Boy, which actually deals with the interface of shamanism. There is this family that goes out on this quest to Mongolia to have their child healed by shamans, autistic child. That's an interesting one to watch. You can get it at Blockbusters.
And it just makes me also say, well, if we're losing our right brain in a sense, but we're also, modern culture isn't interested in religion as much, but we're also very interested in art and music much more. And if you go to a concert, you take drugs, you get a religious experience.
Grateful Dead concert.
I'll come back to you.
Anyone who hasn't gone.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you think that in religious or mystical cultures, there's a tendency to attribute the mystical experience, a greater physical reality than the experience that it's so wide because that strikes me as just positively weird. You have these normal experiences that constitute the vast majority of your total experiences, and this minority experience, and then saying, no, this is the greater experience here. This is more indicative of truth. And these other experiences of which we have way more. That is the case.
Well, then, I think that's an interesting observation. It seems like, cultures, one of the things that within cultures, there seems to be a need for developing structures to domesticate, right? These kinds of experiences. And often there develops a system, an institutionalization, a system of orthodoxy, which validates one kind and then dismisses the vast majority. It seems like in a lot of the religious cultures we're talking about, it's not what the experiences that are lauded and narrated and talked about are not the experiences of most people. Most people's lives are loaded with these experiences, and so that's a polarization that often is just a habit of cultures. I think so.
I also really want to emphasize again, sort of the pragmatic aspects of this. And I think part of why, this is coming back, or the need to explore this, or why we are so stoked up about it, is really because the current arrangement in our brains doesn't serve us well, right? It's insufficient. There is something about that doesn't work very well, where we have this experience of whatever, being out of balance or whatever we want to call. And, in societies, and, it's easier because they're mostly smaller scale societies, the connection between these experience and everyday life and the pragmatics of everyday life are much, much closer. When you go to a Hopi dance, there is a mystical experience there. You go into a trance and you see all this. At the same time, there's all this exchange of food. There's this community building. There's all this other stuff going on, You get gifts and, all this other stuff. So it's not isolated.
Talking about, I think it was Paul as being kind of a maniac, beginners of religion. Now, I'm just thinking about like Assisi, Francis. He was also a mystic. He didn't begin a religion, but he began a movement within a religion. He had to just kind of let the movement go. He started more like the mystical love path. So, kind of a caution against all mystical leaders and
Right, I did, and if I know you didn't prejudice, right, I don't, right. Assisi's a great example, and the politics is interesting there because Assisi had many forerunners who said basically the same thing. They were killed by the church. They were stoned to death and burned to death. And Assisi was saying essentially the same thing, and he followed a mystical path. It was all about love and all about connection to nature and so on. And for some reason, he occurred at the right place at the right time, so that he was given an order and sort of let go But yeah, he's an example. He's certainly a counterexample, right? Last two, yeah. We need to clear the room, unfortunately.
Okay. But first of all, I'm sorry that that guy who wrote about this week left because it made me think of a statistic that people who have had higher education, people who have had college educations, are at higher risk of having an autistic child. People who develop their left brains have children who are maybe more left brain dominant and have less of that focus in the right brain. Second, your guys' 2 cents on deja vu with respect to mystical experience. And my boyfriend is rather more spiritual than I am, and he insists that we have met before this life. He feels like he's had dreams about me. He knew who I was when he met me. So, just how common is that? Is that a type?
I'll just say, Roxanne, you put your finger on the thing for me that I've had many of those, and from talking to people, I gather that they're very common. I've had experiences that are way, way beyond a momentary deja vu. That dreams that seem to have lived out in front of me a year later or a month later, and I don't know what to make of that. I have no idea. I mean, the basic way that I have a tendency to parse reality doesn't really have a very good place for it. I don't know what to do with it. And so I can just kind of leave it there at the moment.
I think there's a mindset, and I think it's one the three of us would want to encourage, which is a don't know mind, don't know, not sure, don't need to necessarily have a story, curious investigation, privileging experience.
Can just be like some good food that you had. You know, I mean, the experience rather than sort of putting it on a pedestal. You know, it's just part of life. You know, which I think, you know, I mean, this relates to the issue of inflation. You know, I mean, that's part of the human potential, and at times we experience it, and it's just, you know, and we don't need to, whatever, do anything special about it other than acknowledge it and go on. And you know, I've had those experiences too, and you know, they're interesting and they're also fun.
Yeah. Okay. It's a gift. It's a gift. That experience is a gift.
A gift.
Yeah.
It's okay to leave it. Yeah.
Yeah, grace. Mm-hmm.
Another thing is, has anyone ever seen a light being
A being of light? No, not me. I talked to people who've had near-death experiences.
Yeah, I know.
Flatline, but yeah.
Interested in the Zen master giving us not designing but teaching us and how those three categories could come together and what it might look like. Those three separate things that you have on the board, if those were to come together in one, mystical experiences, rationality, and madness, what would that look like?
I don't know. I think one of the things we're striving for is oftentimes a tendency when you play in this playground to get rid of the reason. And I think what the three of us have in common is that we're not willing to do that. Not willing to get rid of reason. Or not to the other side, which is use reason to get rid of this stuff. And it's interesting, you know, if I was to think about the Buddhist tradition. Have you guys seen pictures of Tibetan monks arguing? And they engage in some of the most elegant forms of reason, but the reason is in service of much deeper experience. It's one of the ways to express that deeper experience, your ability to not have to even stop and think about the argument you're making. But the argument you're making is a very reasoned argument. So I think one of the unfortunate paths we've gone down is to separate things. And I think Jürgen's trying to say that in a number of different ways, that they should service each other, and can service each other. And in cultures that are not as, bifurcated as ours, they do service each other.
I had an experience, I've had a similar experience several times. One time I was composing a lecture, and at the same time I was with my 5-year-old, and we were throwing rocks in a river over on the Greenbelt thing, the Santa Rosa Creek thing, and we were throwing rocks in the water, and I was composing a lecture, and we were just having fun, and I was composing a lecture, which I do orally, and I was feeling really euphoric because I was having a flood of really good ideas, and I was talking out the ideas audibly, and I was gesturing as we were throwing, and a guy nearby called the police.
Oh, that's horrible.
Mystical, rational madness.
That's a good way to end this.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for hanging in there.